path, that is the direction of motion in English, is encoded separately in a satellite outside the verb. So, rushed in, yeah? Strolled along, right? Strolled, rushed. There's so many of these. So, English is called what's called a satellite framed language, where the path is coded in a satellite outside the verb. And manner tends to accompany the verb, right? Now, Japanese is different. It's what you call a verb-framed language, yeah? Where the path tends to be encoded on the verb motion, and manner, if it's used at all, is separate in an adverbial phrase, like hayaku deta, usoide haita. That's called a verb-framed language. And this is a distinction which is observed to be widely predictive of differences between different language types. So, Danish and English are satellite framed, Korean and Japanese and Spanish too are verb framed. Right? Languages seem to fall on one side or another. Chinese is a bit of a, that's what they call, what is it called? Chinese is a sort of middle example, but there's not many like it. So we were interested in whether or not task complexity would have an effect on accuracy in this typological domain. And what we did was we asked all of the learners were learners of English, the satellite frame language, where it's typical to encode manner and motion together and paths separately, rushed in, along, etc. So that was the language they were learning. It was a satellite frame language. And we had two groups of learners. We had Japanese learners of English, that's the ones I studied, where their first language is typologically different. And we had, Teresa is in Denmark, so she was using Danish learners of English, which Danish itself is a satellite frame language like English. So what's the story what might you expect? It's going to be more difficult for the non-typologically similar second language learners, that's Japanese, to be accurate in using verbs to describe reference to motion and path than it is for Danish learners of English. Because basically the story is that when you describe motion and path in Danish as your first language, you do it in the same way that you do in English as a second language. You put manner and motion on the verb together, and path is separate, the satellite. Now, for Japanese learners, it's a bit more difficult because you've got to learn the English way of what they call thinking for speaking. This is Dan Slogan stuff. You've got to learn that manner is quite important in referring to motion in English as a second language, and the paths can be expressed outside the motion verb and strung together in a concatenated series of satellites. Yeah. In other words, Japanese learners have to think in a satellite frame way about referring to motion, which is different from their usual verb frame way. Now, what effect I was hoping, being the eternal optimist, that task complexity would push both groups, both the typologically different typologically similar Danish and typologically different Japanese. The complex version of this task requiring reference to motion would push both groups to be more accurate and target-like in their use of verbs of motion and reference to path. Now, what happened? We looked at that. Just to summarize what I said, Japanese compared to English or Danish has few verbs complaining manner and motion. In order to refer to manner in Japanese, it takes extra effort. Slogan talks. You have to make extra effort of encoding manner. So it tends to be avoided in Japanese reference to motion. In contrast, path is conflated on the verb, airu, separately. So we examined the extent to which this typological difference affected second language performance on simple and here and now and complex there and then tasks requiring reference to motion. Craig, remind me, when do I finish? 50, okay. Now, I think this is really important, and you know, we're in the stratosphere here. We're going way beyond anything that people have done so far, but it makes sense to go this way. Because I don't think it's only going to be, it turns out, I was hoping it would only be task demand and the cognitive demands of tasks that pushed greater accuracy and complexity. But as we'll see, that claim probably has to be mitigated to account for areas of typological difference between the language being learned and the first language. I'll show you what I mean here. And I think it's fascinating, and I think it's an area where we can do a lot more work, right? And the room for work in this area is huge. People have done that work on typological differences in first and second, between the first and second language and how it affects development, but they've never looked at the effects of task complexity on this. Okay, so we examine the extent to which this difference, Danish similar to satellite-framed English, Japanese different from satellite-framed English, affected performance on simple and complex tasks. We found a trend to greater conflation of manner and motion on complex tasks for typologically similar L1 to L2 English learners, but the opposite for typologically dissimilar L1 Japanese, L2 English learners. I said trend, right? I mean, if we'd had enough subjects, of course, this would have become significant, but that doesn't matter. Something is moving in the bushes here, and I think it's quite important to look at this. What's happening here then? Let's have a look at this. So we've got the here and now and the there and then. Remember, the here and now is the simple version. They're telling the story while they're looking at the picture of Mr. Brown passing in the street. Tramp throws his hand. The there and then is the condition where they see a similar kind of story. There are different stories, but all of them involve reference to motion. And they have to remember it and tell it, possibly use the past tense. So what happens? You can see that on the here and now, here we're looking at an interaction bar plot for plus manner verbs. What does that mean? Well, that's the use of manner verbs in English. Like, that's a verb that conflates manner and motion. Like, rushed, walked, actually. Go is not. Go is just a motion verb, right? Blow is not manner of motion. I'll talk about this in a minute. When the wind blew, that's motion plus cause. We don't think blow is a manner, right? I'll talk about some of these in a minute. In fact, I've got me and Teresa, we had to do a huge coding manual here. I think I brought it with me. Yeah, here it is. Just read out some of the verbs that were used and how we coded them for the kind of semantic information they contain. So blow is a verb of motion, and we think that encodes motion plus cause. Blow is caused motion. Bring is also motion. Yeah, he brought a suitcase, but we think it's caused motion. Because brought involves movement, right? And blow involves some conceptual, there's a concept of motion, right? You can't have blow if nothing is blown. But what accompanies the motion is cause, not manner. Fly, on the other hand, is motion plus manner. Yeah? To move through the air in a particular manner called flying. Now, what else have we got here? We've got run, which is to walk along the ground in a particular manner called running. We have lots of these. Move is simply motion. It's not cause or manner. Turn is an interesting verb in English. This is motion and manner, right? But it also involves a path. Turn conflates three semantic elements. Turn, as a verb, refers not only to motion and manner, which is circular, but path. Walk is a verb which involves reference to motion, but in a particular manner, which is not like running. So now, this may be difficult for some people, and it was for me and Teresa to some extent, but we shared intuitions about, and there are big coding manuals. You can look at other people who've looked at this stuff in the literature, which is nice, how they coded verbs for what semantic elements they conflate. But, so in this bar chart, we're looking at the extent to which Japanese and Danish use verbs that refer to motion and manner, as is typical in English. And we find that on the here and now in the task, the Japanese are and the Danish, they're not the same. As we know, the Danish do this in their first language, so if you like, they're sensitive to it in English. They're more open to conflating manner and motion and learning the translation equivalents, if you like, in English than the Japanese are. But they're roughly similar. There's about 24% of the verbs the Japanese use are manner verbs compared to 32% the Danish. But when you increase the complexity of the task, what happens? Something quite interesting, suggestive. When you increase the complexity of the task, right, by requiring the there and then, so they have to remember the story, think hard, it pushes the typologically similar to L1 English learners to use more manner verbs. And you can see that the Japanese use of manner verbs goes down. So what do I think is happening here? This is not what I hoped would happen. Being the eternal optimist, I hope that forcing learners to think hard about the task demands would push them, both groups, to become more accurate or more target-like in their use of verbs of motion. That is, they will become more like the English by referring to manner on the complex tasks more than the simple. But we don't find, in fact, we find an interesting trend. Where it's a typologically similar language, and you're used to conflating manner and motion in your first language, you transfer that predisposition to task performance on the complex task. The complex task seems to push you to revert, if you like, to your preferred L1-based way of thinking for speaking. For the Danish, and the same for the Japanese. When the task gets complex, they go back to their verb-framed way of referring to motion, and they avoid referring to manner. So it looks like, in some sense, your L1 predisposes you to adopt certain ways of referring to motion. And when the task is really complex, you will fall back on those, with the consequence that if your language is like English, for example, in this domain, you'll become more native-like. If your language is typologically dissimilar, for example, in this domain, you'll become less native-like. That seems to make sense. When the task is complex, you go back to your L1 preferred way of thinking for speaking, and it can have differing effects for both groups. It's sort of interesting. So we have to mitigate claims about the effects of task complexity and accuracy, because it looks like these two groups are being affected in different ways because of the typological difference and similarity of their first to the second language. Now, we didn't just look at manner verbs, we've got a whole coding manual here. We looked at loads of stuff. This is just part of the coding manual. We also looked at what we call sense target-like lexicalization construction or pattern. What does that mean? So we make these units of analysis up, but we think there are good reasons for using them. Nobody has looked at the effects of task demands on, you know, the accuracy and complexity of reference to motion in this way before. So we thought a target like what native speakers are like when they use English, what's most characteristic of native speakers of English, is to conflate motion and manner on the verb and express paths separately in one or more satellites. So a target-like lexicalization pattern, which is, you know, a specific measure of accuracy, is the tramp walked, motion and manner, along the path past Mr. Brown's path. So that's also called something that's typical of English speakers. It's called event conflation, putting a number of path satellites together. So let's just say that we have the specific measure, motion and manner together on the verb, path separate. Because that's target-like lexicalization pattern. Then we looked at how many target-like lexicalization patterns were obvious on the simple and the complex version. So we found, I don't know, is this on your handout? This one? Yeah, okay. So we found a similar effect here again, and I'm not going to say it's overwhelming evidence that me and Teresa should share the Nobel Prize or anything, but it looks a little bit like this, that the same effect, that on the here and now, relative to the there and then, more complex version, the Danish speakers are producing more target-like lexicalization patterns. Whereas it looked slightly less for the Japanese. Again, this is evidence again that L1, what preferred ways of thinking for speaking, are influencing accuracy on complex tasks. Here's some of the data, or as I say, data, because I'm English. You know, Americans say tomato, English people say tomato. Americans say potato. What do you think English people say? So Americans say data, English people say data. Americans say tomato, English people say tomato. Americans say potato. What do English people say? They don't say potato. Are you crazy? They say potato. It's just a little joke. It works with our younger vocabulary. Never mind. Okay, back to the stuff. Here is some data or data. This is This is Japanese people performing, telling a story that involves reference to motion. Divided up into clauses, right? With motion verbs in italics. That was when a wind blew. It's motion and cause. And Mr. Brown's hat blew off, motion and cause. And the tramp that was walking in front of him, okay, so there we've got motion plus manner, that's underlined. In front of him, so there we've got a target-like lexicalization pattern. Can you see at the side of the TLL? That's one. There's one target-like lexicalization pattern, that's it. Motion and manner, walking, hat in front. Catch his hat, that's motion. But there's no, that's causal motion, right? So that's not motion and manner. Took, forget how we coded that. I think that again is causal motion. Check it. Put, again, that's a motion verb, but it's not manner. And through, again, I think we coded that one. What do we say? Put is motion and cause. Through is motion and cause. We looked through Slobin and Berman and Slobin. And there's lots of work in this area that you can use to base your classification system on, which is nice. So what have we got? We've only got in that data by the Japanese learner. We've got 7 motion verbs, right? And only one of them occurs in the target-like lexicalization pattern. Blue, blue, walking, in. That's the old target-like lexicalization. Took, put, through. So that's 14% of the verbs of motion are used in a target. That's 1 out of 7 as a percentage. Yeah? You okay there? Right? Out of verbs of motion used, only one of them is used in the target-like lexicalization pattern, 14%. Are you okay with that? Right. And here's the Danish. Now, right. So Mr. Brown in his shadow is walking along, or walked. Self-repair is walking along. Stop it. Walked along. So there, target-like lexicalization, motion, manner, and pattern. And it seems like the shadow was attached to him. So they walked along again. Target-like lexicalization. Suddenly the wind started blowing, but it was not blowing on Mr. Brown. These are all motion, but it was blowing on his shadow. He lost his hat, and the shadow started running off. Motion, manner, pattern. Without Mr. Brown even noticing, the shadow catched his hat. He turned around. Okay, that's motion, manner, pattern. Started running towards. He attached. I think that's caused motion. And walked along. So you can see, you get the feeling, this is the Danish learners, essentially telling us there's a tendency, a predisposition for them to adopt the way of referring to motion that they had in their first language, which is to attach the manner to the motion verb and lots of satellites separately. So there are 12 motion verbs, 6 of them are target-like lexicalization pattern, which makes 50% target-like lexicalization. So it's just one of the ways that we captured this difference. Between typologically similar and different with respect to the effect of complex task demands on accuracy. And the story there, of course, is, as I just said, demands have variable effects on accuracy in specific domains, depending on typological similarity of the first language to the second language. Quite complicated, but there's a few PhDs in it for you. Now, a third claim is not that there'll be greater accuracy and complexity using general versus and also specific measures, but that on complex versions of tasks there'll be more interaction, as well as more uptake and retention of information available in the interaction, right, on complex tasks. Yeah? If you like, complex tasks, because they're harder, they require greater mental effort, you'll look for more and more input in the task input. You'll look for more and more help in the input to help you perform the task. Yeah? If it's a simple task, you don't really need any help, so you're not so sensitive to what's in the input. So if there's a recast in the input of a simple task, you maybe ignore it. But on a complex task, you'll leap on it, use it, and retain it because it's helpful to you in performing the complex task. So this claim is that increasing complexity leads to great amounts of interaction, uptake, and forms may say that proactively. You can give learners help. You can provide them with language to help them perform the task before they perform it, as in the case of the study I'm just going to report to you. Or you can you can make forms salient in the input to tasks during task performance. That's recasting. Yeah. You can draw their attention, if you like, to something that they've said that's wrong grammatically. And so the prediction is that both on proactive and reactive techniques for focusing learner attention on form, these will be more effective on complex tasks than simple tasks, because learners need more and more help on complex tasks. Let's have a look at this one. This is this study has been superseded by this is, I think, the first one actually. But there's studies now that have superseded this much better as well. Eugene Kim has got a great study coming out in studies in second language acquisition. You can say that now, next year, showing that task complexity, together with recasts targeted at developmental features like WH questions using Pieneman's taxonomy of different developmental stages, forces greater uptake and incorporation of recasts and development of the ability to use question forms than simple tasks. We've got Andrea Ravesciu's paper in Studies in Second Language Acquisition 2 years ago, 2009. She's got another one coming out in Modern Language Journal this year, or next year, 2012, looking at similar issues. And who else? I'm sure there's another one. Reves, Mackey and Sachs in this book got studies of these same thing. So essentially what we're looking at is interaction uptake, and not simply recasts. We're adding another modifier variable, if you like, task complexity. So we expect recasts to be useful to learners, but we're expecting learners to want to use and remember the recast information more on complex compared to simple tasks. Makes sense, yeah? Why pay attention to what people are telling you unless you feel it's going to be important to help you to perform the task? On a complex task, they'll do that more than a simple task. So in this study, just investigating these things, what I did was look at proactively provided input. What I did was, on the same task that I just talked to you about, the reasoning task, where they had to, but this was a different version of it, this was an interactive version, where one person had to, where one person had to look at pictures, decide on the sequence in which the pictures go, and tell the story. But in this version of that task, intentional reasoning demands task, the other person could ask questions about whether or not the order was correct. You know, they could check, do confirmation check, clarification.